They call it the devil's excrement. That was the term used by Juan Pablo Pérez Alfonso, the Venezuelan minister who helped found OPEC. He warned that oil would not bring prosperity, but ruin. He saw the future, a nation blinded by the glitter of black gold, only to wake up in a nightmare of worthless paper and empty stomachs. Venezuela sits on the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, more than Saudi Arabia, more than Russia, more than the United States. By all laws of logic, it should be the wealthiest nation in the hemisphere. Instead, it is the site of the greatest economic collapse in modern history outside of wartime. This is not just a story of bad luck. It is a secret history of how a currency, the Bolivar, was sacrificed at the altar of populism, corruption, and a global commodity trap. Today, we trace the journey from Saudi Venezuela to the breadlines of Caracas. To understand the fall, you must understand how high they flew. In the 1970s, Caracas was the Paris of the South. While the rest of Latin America was embroiled in civil wars and military coups, Venezuela was a stable, glittering democracy. The 1973 oil shock. When the Arab-Israeli War triggered the 1973 oil embargo, the price of crude tripled. Overnight, Venezuela was flooded with more cash than its treasury knew how to handle. This period was known as Venezuela Saudita. The government's budget doubled, then tripled. They built skyscrapers, massive hydroelectric dams, and the most advanced subway system in Latin America. The Bolivar was so strong it was nicknamed the greenback of the South. Venezuelans became famous in Miami for their "give me two" shopping sprees, buying luxury goods in pairs because their money was so powerful. But a dangerous habit was forming. Because the government was flush with oil cash, they began to subsidize everything: bread, milk, and most importantly, gasoline. Fuel became cheaper than bottled water. The people began to view the state not as a protector, but as a provider. The link between hard work, production, and wealth was severed. Wealth didn't come from a factory or a farm. It came from a hole in the ground. In economics, there is a phenomenon called the Dutch disease. It is the secret history behind Venezuela's poverty. The mechanics of ruin. When a country exports a massive amount of a single resource, like oil, it causes the value of its currency to skyrocket. On the surface, this sounds good, but there is a catch. A strong bolivar made foreign goods, like American corn or Chinese clothes, incredibly cheap to import. Conversely, it made anything produced in Venezuela, like Venezuelan coffee or shoes, too expensive for the rest of the world to buy. By the late 1970s, Venezuela was importing 80% of its food. Farmers left their fields to move to the cities, hoping for a government job funded by oil. The country was no longer a productive society. It was a rentier state. It lived on the rent paid by the world for its oil. This meant that the moment oil prices dropped, Venezuela would have nothing to sell to the world and no way to feed its own people. The trap was set. Every collapse has a point of no return. For Venezuela, it was Viernes Negro, Black Friday. The party ends. In the early 1980s, the global oil glut caused prices to tumble. Simultaneously, the U.S. Federal Reserve raised interest rates, making Venezuela's massive international debts impossible to pay. On February 18, 1983, the government could no longer support the fixed exchange rate of the Bolivar. They devalued the currency. In an instant, the savings of millions of Venezuelans lost a third of their value. This was the end of the Saudi era. The middle class was hollowed out. Poverty rates, which had been falling for decades, began to climb. The social contract, the idea that the government would provide a high standard of living in exchange for political loyalty, began to shred. This economic trauma created a vacuum. People were angry, hungry, and looking for a savior. They were looking for someone to blame the corrupt elites and the foreign bankers.
This anger would eventually lead to the rise of a charismatic paratrooper named Hugo Chavez.
Hugo Chavez didn't just promise a better economy, he promised a revolution. He called it 21st century socialism. The 1998 turning point. When Chavez took office, oil was at a low point, about $10 a barrel. But then, history repeated itself. The 2000s saw the greatest commodity supercycle in history. As China industrialized, the demand for oil exploded. Prices climbed to $100, then $140 a barrel. Chavez found himself with a petro-windfall, even larger than the one in the 1970s. He used it to launch missions, social programs that brought doctors to the slums and literacy to the countryside. Dismantling the country's economic guardrails. He fired 18,000 workers at PDVSA, the state oil company, who went on strike and replaced them with political loyalists. He began seizing private companies, farms, supermarkets, glass factories, and hotels. His message was, the state will run everything, and the oil will pay for it. But when the state runs a farm and the state doesn't know how to farm, the cows die. And when the cows die, you have to use oil money to buy beef from abroad. By 2003, capital was fleeing Venezuela. To stop the bleed, Hugo Chavez did something that would become the cornerstone of the country's corruption. He implemented strict currency controls. He created Khedive. The multi-tiered lie. Under Khedive, you couldn't just go to a bank and buy dollars. You had to apply to the government. If you were importing essential goods like medicine, the government gave you dollars at a preferential rate, say 6 bolivars per dollar. But on the street, a dollar was worth 50 bolivars. This created the most lucrative get-rich-quick scheme in human history. It was called arbitrage. If you were a well-connected businessman, you could request $1 million from the government at the preferential rate to import medical equipment. You would spend $100,000 on junk equipment, ship it to Venezuela, and then take the remaining $900,000 and sell it on the black market. In one afternoon, you could turn a few million bolivars into a billion. The death of honest business. Why build a factory? Why grow corn? Why innovate? The easiest way to make money in Venezuela was no longer through productivity, it was through access. The Khedive system didn't stop capital flight, it institutionalized it. An estimated $300 billion was stolen through this exchange rate trap. This was money that should have been in the nation's hospitals and schools. Instead, it was in bank accounts in Miami, Switzerland, and Panama. To Chavez, private property was a suggestion, not a right. In his quest for 21st century socialism, he began a campaign of mass expropriation. Over 1,000 companies were seized by the state. The failure of state-run industry. The government took over the largest steel mill, Sidor, the largest cement company, and millions of acres of farmland. The logic was that the people would now own the means of production. But the people didn't run these factories, political loyalists did. Productivity plummeted. The steel mill that once exported to the world suddenly couldn't produce enough rebar for local construction. The farms that once grew surplus sugar now required imports. The imported economy. Because domestic production was dead, Venezuela had to import everything, and they paid for those imports with oil. This created a terrifying fragility. Venezuela had become a one-way pipe. Oil went out, and everything else, bread, toilet paper, medicine, car parts, came in. The bolivar was no longer backed by a productive economy, it was solely backed by the fluctuating price of a barrel of heavy crude. In 2013, Hugo Chavez died of cancer. He left behind a nation in mourning and a hand-picked successor, Nicolás Maduro, a former bus driver and union leader. Inheriting the storm.
Maduro didn't have Chávez's charisma, nor did he have his luck. He inherited a house of cards. The massive social spending of the golden decade had been funded by high oil prices, but the infrastructure of the oil industry itself, the pumps, the refineries, the pipelines, had been neglected for years. PDVSA, the state oil giant, was being used as a piggy bank for social programs. They weren't reinvesting in the wells. Consequently, oil production began a slow, agonizing decline. Maduro was forced to double down on his predecessor's policies, but the bank account was starting to dry up. In late 2014, the unthinkable happened. The global price of oil collapsed. For any other country, this would be a recession. For Venezuela, it was an apocalypse. The math of disaster. Venezuela needed oil to be at $120 a barrel to balance its bloated budget. When it hit $40, the government's revenue vanished. Suddenly, Maduro couldn't afford to import the food the country no longer grew. This is when the secret history of the poverty became visible. The supermarket shelves went bare. The lines, las colas, began to stretch for blocks. People would wait for 8 hours for a single bag of flour or a bottle of cooking oil. The decision to print. Narrator: Maduro faced a choice: cut spending and admit the revolution had failed, or find money where none existed. He chose the latter. He ordered the Central Bank of Venezuela to start printing bolivars at industrial scale to cover the deficit. This was the match that lit the fire of hyperinflation. If there is no food in the stores and the government hands everyone a stack of new bills, the price of the non-existent food doesn't stay the same, it rockets toward the moon. The bolivar was no longer money, it was a countdown clock. By 2018, the inflation rate in Venezuela reached a number that the human brain struggles to comprehend: 1.3 million%. The daily reset. In a hyperinflationary environment, prices don't change by the year or the month, they change by the hour. Workers would receive their salary in the morning and sprint to the store to buy anything, literally anything, because by the afternoon, their wages would lose 20% of their value. Savings accounts that could once buy a house now couldn't buy a loaf of bread. A lifetime of hard work was erased by the clicking of a digital ledger at the central bank. The redenomination farce. To hide the failure, the government kept slashing zeros off the currency. They introduced the sovereign bolivar, then the digital bolivar. Each time they cut 5 or 6 zeros off the bills. It was like trying to fix a broken leg with a Band-Aid. You can rename the currency as much as you want, but if the people don't trust the government, the paper is just colorful trash. The bolivar had died. The only question was what would replace it.
When a currency dies, the people it served are forced to move. This is the migration of despair. Since 2014, more than 7.9 million Venezuelans have fled their homeland. To put that in perspective, that is roughly 25% of the entire population. It is the largest displacement crisis in the history of the Western Hemisphere. The first to leave were the doctors, the engineers, and the oil experts, the people with the resources to buy a plane ticket. But as the bolivar plummeted, the exodus turned into a pedestrian crisis. Millions began to walk, los caminantes, crossing borders into Colombia, Peru, and Chile on foot. The loss of human capital is perhaps the most permanent scar on the Venezuelan economy. In 2024, estimates showed that over 13,000 doctors had left the country. Hospitals were left with shimmering machines, but no one to operate them. And schools were left with empty desks as teachers realized their monthly salary could no longer buy a single carton of eggs. For 20 years, the Chavista regime preached against the Yankee dollar, calling it a tool of imperialist oppression. But by 2019, the revolution was saved by the very thing it hated: the silent surrender. Faced with total collapse, Nicolás Maduro did something unthinkable. He looked the other way. He allowed the US dollar to circulate freely. This wasn't a planned policy, it was a surrender to reality.
Today, over 70% of transactions in Venezuela are conducted in USD. The economy has split into two worlds. There are those with access to greens, remittances from family abroad or jobs in the private sector, and those who still rely on the red bolivar. This is the ultimate irony of 21st century socialism. It created a society with more extreme wealth inequality than the capitalist era it replaced. The dollar brought stability to the shelves, but it left the poorest Venezuelans behind, stuck in a hyperinflationary trap with no exit. How does a regime survive when its currency is worth less than the paper it's printed on? The answer lies in the shadow economy, the arco minero. When oil production failed, the regime turned to the arco minero, a vast region of the Amazon rich in gold, coltan, and diamonds. This is a world beyond law, run by military cartels and armed gangs known as pranes. This blood gold provides the hard currency the regime needs to keep the military loyal, even while the average soldier's official salary is less than $10 a month. Venezuela is a warning to the world. It is a case study in what happens when a nation confuses resource wealth with productivity. The final lesson: the bolivar didn't die because of a conspiracy. It died because it was decoupled from the truth. It was used as a tool for political fantasy rather than an anchor for economic reality. The tragedy of Venezuela is that it had everything: the oil, the land, the people, and the location. It chose a path that turned its greatest blessing into a curse. As the world moves toward a green energy future, many other petro-states face a similar crossroads. Will they diversify, or will they follow the bolivar into the abyss? The history of money is the history of trust, and once trust is burned, it takes generations to find the embers.